The daughter-in-law, with a glacial smile that didn't reach her eyes, led the elderly mother-in-law to the edge of the abyss. The old woman, frail and dependent on her crutch, barely understood the desolate scene, her cloudy eyes fixed on the void. For the daughter-in-law, it was the perfect solution. Nature, with its relentless gravity, would take care of the burden. A subtle push, almost a detachment, and the diminutive figure of the mother-in-law began to lean over the precipice, the crutch slipping from her trembling hands. But suddenly, a colossal shadow moved. A fierce bull with imposing horns and a deep gaze leaned over the rocky edge. With an instinctive precision that defied reason, one of its horns hooked onto the strap of the crutch that the old woman still held by a thread. The fatal fall was interrupted. The woman, suspended in the air, swayed precariously, yet safe, as the bull held her firm, an unexpected guardian against human cruelty. The daughter-in-law's glacial smile froze into a mask of disbelief. Her eyes, previously devoid of emotion, now burned with a silent fury, a toxic mix of shock and frustration. The impossible had happened. Nature, which she expected to be her silent accomplice, had rebelled spectacularly, and a bull, a creature of instinct and brute force, had become the unlikely guardian of her victim. The old woman, suspended in mid-air, swayed like a macabre pendulum, the crutch now a precarious link between life and death, firmly hooked on the animal's imposing horn. To the daughter-in-law, it was a personal affront. Her plan, so meticulously orchestrated, so perfectly executed, had been undone by a whim of fate, or perhaps by an intervention she refused to comprehend. The bull, a colossus of muscle and dark hide, remained motionless, its head tilted over the edge, its deep, enigmatic gaze fixed on some distant point in the abyss. There was no rage in its eyes, no apparent intent, just a massive and unwavering presence. It was as if the cliff itself had come alive to defy her. The old woman, in turn, was trapped in a limbo of terror and confusion. The wind whipped her fragile body, making her clothes flap against the void. The smell of damp earth and wild animal filled her nostrils, mixed with the metallic odor of fear. Her cloudy eyes, previously fixed on nothingness, now widened, trying to decipher the dark shape above her, the source of her temporary salvation. The crutch strap, once a support, was now a noose, the rough leather cutting into the wrinkled skin of her hand, the only thing separating her from the fatal fall. Every fiber of her being screamed, but no sound escaped her parched throat. She was an object, suspended between two worlds, at the mercy of a beast and human cruelty. The daughter-in-law took a hesitant step forward, the tip of her shoe almost touching the edge. The precipice seemed to laugh at her, an abyss of darkness and sharp rocks, now denied its prey. Her mind seethed with options, each more desperate than the last. Could she try to unhook the crutch, push the bull? The idea was absurd, dangerous. The animal, though still, emanated an aura of indomitable power. One false move, and she herself could be the next to plummet. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity of suspense. The sun, which had previously illuminated the scene with an unforgiving light, now began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, as if nature itself were observing the drama unfold. Shadows lengthened, swallowing the cliff edge, adding a layer of darkness to the already grim situation. The daughter-in-law clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. The old woman, that burden, that obstacle to her freedom and inheritance, was still alive, and worse, she was being protected by an irrational creature. The humiliation was unbearable. If someone saw her now, if the story spread, her reputation, her carefully constructed life would crumble. Panic began to mix with her rage, a dangerous cocktail of emotions. Below, the echo of the wind carried the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks. a constant reminder of the dizzying distance. The old woman, with tear-filled eyes, felt the strength in her hand diminish, her grip on the crutch becoming increasingly tenuous, her heartbeat erratically, a frantic drum in her chest. She didn't know how much longer she could hold on. Life, which seemed to have been torn from her moments before, now clung to a thread, to a piece of leather, and the horn of an animal she never imagined would be her savior. The bull, with a slight movement of its head, adjusted its position. It wasn't an abrupt movement, but enough to make the crutch creak, and the old woman let out a gasping, almost inaudible sigh. Her body swayed even more, the sensation of imminent fall returning with full force. The daughter-in-law watched, her eyes fixed on the crutch, calculating, scheming. The old woman couldn't hold on much longer. Gravity, her original ally, was still there, patient, waiting. The silence was broken only by the howl of the wind and the flapping wings of a solitary vulture circling in the sky, a dark speck against the twilight. The scene was surreal, a macabre painting of despair and cruelty, where the line between predator and prey had been distorted by an act of animal intervention. The daughter-in-law knew she couldn't stay there forever. Night was approaching, and with it, the darkness that could both conceal her crime and reveal her failure. She needed to act, and fast. The question was no longer if the old woman would fall, but how and when, and more importantly, how she could ensure the fall happened, leaving no trace, no witnesses, and no interference from any more unexpected guardians. The bull, the improbable hero, remained there, an enigma of flesh and bone, the old woman's fate literally hanging from its horn. The tension was palpable, breath held, as the world waited to see who would yield first. Time, once a silent ally, now became a relentless executioner. The sun, fading on the horizon, stained the sky blood-red, as if nature itself were bleeding, observing the macabre drama unfolding on the edge of the abyss. For the daughter-in-law, every second was torture, a stark reminder of her failure. The old woman, that burden, still swayed there, suspended by a leather thread and the absurd intervention of an animal. Humiliation was a poison corroding her insides, mixing with growing panic. If night fell and the old woman was still there, or worse, if someone passed through that desolate place and witnessed the scene, her life, her reputation, everything would crumble like the loose stones of that cliff. Her eyes, previously fixed on the crutch, now darted frantically between the bull, her mother-in-law, and the precipice. Her mind seethed, searching for a solution, any solution. Pushing the bull was unthinkable. The beast, though inert, was a mountain of muscle and contained fury. One false step, and she herself could join her mother-in-law in the void. Scream? It would alarm anyone nearby, and the bull could react unpredictably. The only certainty was that the old woman needed to fall, and she needed to fall now. The daughter-in-law took another cautious step, the tip of her soft leather shoes almost kissing the slippery rock. The wind howled, a ghostly lament that seemed to mock her impotence. Below, the sound of waves crashing on the rocks was a constant invitation to fall, a reminder of the fate she had planned and which had been denied her. She observed her mother-in-law's wrinkled hand, which clung to the crutch strap with surprising tenacity, though visibly weakened. The rough leather must already be cutting into the thin skin, and the tremor in her hanging body was increasingly pronounced. The old woman wouldn't last much longer. But not much longer wasn't now. Her hungry gaze finally landed on something. Not far from the edge, half buried in the packed earth, lay a piece of shale, chipped and sharp at one end, like a primitive blade. Perfect. With quick, decisive steps, she bent down and tore it from the ground. The cold weight of the rock in her hand was comforting, an instrument of her will. Adrenaline pulsed through her veins, replacing panic with a glacial determination. With the stone in hand, the daughter-in-law approached the edge again, her eyes fixed on the leather strap connecting the old woman to the crutch and the crutch to the bull's horn. The animal, a colossus of dark hide, remained motionless, its head still tilted, its deep eyes fixed on the abyss. There wasn't a hint of recognition or threat in its gaze, just an ancestral presence, indifferent to human pettiness. It was as if it were part of the rock itself, a silent guardian of a fate she was trying to subvert. The daughter-in-law leaned forward, extending her arm with the sharp stone. The growing darkness made the task more difficult, but the silhouette of the old woman and the crutch was still visible against the increasingly dark sky. She needed to be quick, precise. One blow, and it would all be over. One blow, and her freedom would be guaranteed. The sound of the waves below seemed to intensify, a macabre chorus for the act she was about to commit. With a grunt of effort and a rage that distorted her face, the daughter-in-law delivered the first blow. The sharp stone struck the leather strap with a dull thud, but the darkness and awkward position made her miss the main target. Instead of cutting the leather, the stone grazed, hitting the old woman's desperately clinging hand. A sharp, hoarse cry escaped the old woman's throat, a sound of pain and terror that pierced the night's silence. The old woman's grip on the crutch diminished even further, her aged and wounded fingers almost letting go. The fragile body swung violently, and for an instant the daughter-in-law thought she had finally succeeded. But the bull, with an almost imperceptible movement of its head, adjusted its horn, keeping the crutch firmly attached. The beast was unyielding. The old woman, despite the excruciating pain, was still hanging. Tears streamed down her wrinkled face, mixing with cold sweat and the blood now oozing from her wounded hand. The daughter-in-law recoiled, panting, the stone still in her hand. Rage bubbled in her chest, a blind fury against the old woman's stubbornness, against the bull's indifference, against the fate that seemed to conspire against her. Night had fallen completely now, and darkness was almost total, except for the faint light of the stars and the rising crescent moon. The night's chill bit her skin, and the daughter-in-law felt a shiver that wasn't just from the wind. She was trapped, cornered by her own cruelty and nature's inexplicable intervention. Time, once an executioner, was now an enemy. She could no longer wait. With eyes hardened by a glacial determination, the daughter-in-law stared at the dark mass of the bull. The stone in her hand, once an instrument for cutting, now transformed into a pathetic weapon against such a creature. But what other choice did she have? The old woman hung by a thread, and the night was a hungry mouth, ready to swallow everything. If the crutch couldn't be pulled, if the strap couldn't be cut, then the anchor itself, the bull, had to be moved. It was a gamble, a desperate throw against an adversary she couldn't comprehend. A shiver ran down her spine, but it wasn't just from the cold. It was the recognition of imminent danger, of the madness of her next action. She took a deep breath, the icy air burning her lungs. The wind whipped her hair, a frantic dance mirroring the chaos in her mind. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to abandon the plan, but the vision of a future free from the old woman's burden fueled her audacity. She had come too far to fail now. With a stealth born of desperation, the daughter-in-law began to circle the bull, maintaining a cautious distance, yet close enough to strike. The animal's dark silhouette was a monolithic presence against the faint starlight, its breathing a low, rhythmic rumble that seemed to vibrate the ground. She aimed for the bull's flank, a less dangerous target than its head, hoping to startle it, to make it shift its weight, even if only a fraction, just enough to dislodge the crutch. Her heart hammered uncontrollably against her ribs, a frantic beat in the oppressive silence. The old woman, a mere bundle of rags and groans below, seemed to shrink further into the abyss, her laments almost inaudible. Nora raised the stone, her arm trembling with a mix of fear and adrenaline. With a guttural grunt, more a growl than a scream, she lunged forward, striking the sharp edge of the shale with all her might. The impact was sickening. The stone struck the bull's thick hide with a dull thud, a sound completely absorbed by the animal's immense body. It was like striking a wall of muscle and bone. The bull didn't bellow, didn't charge, didn't even flinch as a human would. Instead, its massive head, still tilted over the precipice, turned slowly, almost imperceptibly. Its deep, dark eyes, reflecting the faint starlight, fixed on Nora. There was no rage, no pain, no fear. Just that same ancestral, indifferent gaze, now directed squarely at her. A chilling dread, far deeper than the night's cold, seized Nora. It wasn't the gaze of an enraged animal, but of something far more primitive, something that saw through her petty cruelty and judged her with the weight of ages. She froze, the stone still clutched in her hand, her arm aching from the futile blow. The bull's gaze was a physical force, pinning her in place, stripping her of her bravado. Then, with a deliberate slowness that stretched the moment into an eternity, the bull shifted its weight. Not away from the edge, not in alarm, but towards it. Its massive body leaned slightly, its front hooves sinking a little deeper into the loose earth near the abyss. The crutch, still firmly hooked, was pulled taut. The old woman, already hanging by a thread, let out a muffled gasp as her body was pulled further down, her remaining grip on the crutch now agonizingly tenuous. The sound of her hand tearing further, a wet, sickening rip, was almost audible above the wind. Nora watched, horrified. Her attempt to dislodge the bull had failed spectacularly. Instead of backing away, the beast had leaned into the precipice as if to prove a point, to demonstrate its unwavering control over the situation. It was as if the bull understood her intentions and, in its silent ancient wisdom, chose to defy her in the most terrifying way possible. The old woman's moans grew weaker, transforming into almost inaudible laments. Her fingers, bloody and mangled, were losing their grip. Nora could see, even in the near-total darkness. The end was near for the old woman, but not in the way Nora had planned. It would be a slow, agonizing descent, a prolonged torture, and Nora would be a helpless witness, trapped by her own actions and the bull's enigmatic presence. Panic, raw and visceral, clawed at Nora's throat. She had to do something, anything, before the old woman simply slipped, leaving her with the horrific image of her slow death and the bull still there, a silent accuser. The cold, the darkness, the wind, the endless roar of the ocean below. Everything conspired against her, amplifying her terror. Her eyes frantically scanned the surroundings, searching for another solution, however desperate. The stone was useless against the bull. Pushing it was impossible. But what if? What if she could use the bull's own weight against it? A new idea, even more reckless, began to form, born of pure, unadulterated terror and a twisted desire for control. If the bull wouldn't move, perhaps she could force it to move, not by strength, but by leverage. She looked at the ground beneath the bull's front hooves. The earth was loose, sandy in places, with scattered stones. If she could destabilize the ground beneath it. It was a shot in the dark, a suicidal thought, but the alternative was to stand by and watch, a fate worse than any risk to herself. With renewed and desperate energy, Nora dropped the stone and began frantically kicking at the loose earth around the bull's front hooves. Her boots scraped the ground, sending small cascades of stones into the gorge. She grunted with effort, her nails tearing as she clawed at the soil, trying to create a small, unstable area. The bull remained motionless, its gaze unwavering, observing her frantic and pathetic efforts with an almost bored detachment. The old woman's laments had ceased. There was only the sound of the wind, the waves, and Nora's ragged breathing, punctuated by the scratching of her desperate digging. She looked up, her eyes wide with a manic gleam. The old woman's hand was barely clinging, her fingers splayed, red and raw. Any second now, any second. Nora redoubled her efforts, digging with frenetic intensity, oblivious to the pain in her own hands, to the cold biting into her bones. She was a woman possessed, driven by a singular, dark purpose. The bull, a silent ancient sentinel, watched her dance on the edge of her own sanity, on the edge of the precipice, on the edge of a fate far more terrible than she could ever have imagined. Night was complete, and the stage was set for the final act. The earth beneath the bull's hooves was a treacherous mix of loose sand and embedded stones, but the animal's colossal mass compacted it into an unyielding solidity. Nora kicked, clawed, her fingers tearing at the soil with blind fury, but it was like trying to move a mountain with a stick. Each scrape was a hollow sound, an echo of her own impotence. The wind howled, mocking her efforts, and the roar of the ocean below seemed to swallow the small clatter of stones she managed to dislodge, sending them into the abyss. Her lungs burned, the icy air cutting like razors with each ragged breath. Sweat streamed down her forehead, mixing with dust and dirt, and her tangled hair clung to her face. She was exhausted, but adrenaline and panic propelled her. Her eyes, bloodshot and wild, darted up and down, from the stubborn earth to the impassive bull, and then to the old woman who hung like a broken puppet. The old woman's laments had ceased, replaced by a terrifying silence. It was a silence that spoke of pain beyond voice, of a resignation forced by the proximity of death. Nora looked down, to the edge of the precipice. The old woman's hand, once a clenched fist of desperation, was now open, her fingers red and raw, hanging limp. A dark trickle of blood oozed from the wounded palm, slowly dripping into the darkness below. The grip was almost non-existent, an illusion maintained only by inertia and the precarious position. Nora saw. She saw the old woman's last thread of hope unraveling, not in a quick cut, but in a slow, agonizing disintegration. Her eyes widened. It was imminent. The old woman would slip, not be pushed, not be cut. She would simply fall, and Nora would be the sole witness, the sole responsible party, trapped by her own hands and the bull's enigmatic presence. A silent scream tore at Nora's throat. The plan to destabilize the bull was a farce, a useless distraction. She needed something more direct, more immediate. The crutch, the damned crutch. If she couldn't break the bull, perhaps she could break the object that connected her to the old woman. With a sudden, brutal decision, born of pure terror, Nora abandoned the earth and lunged at the bull. Not to push it, not to attack it, but to reach the crutch. Her fingers, previously clawing at the soil, now stretched out desperate for the wooden shaft protruding from the bull's horn. She needed to pull it, twist it, break it, anything to release the old woman. The bull, until then a statue of flesh and bone, reacted, not with anger, not with a bellow, but with a slow, deliberate movement of its head. It was a minimal movement, almost imperceptible to a casual observer, but to Nora, who was inches from it, it was a seismic tremor. The horn, which had been tilted downwards, rotated slightly upwards, tightening its grip on the crutch's leather strap even further. It was as if the bull were adjusting its hold, not to release, but to hold on more firmly. The crutch creaked. It didn't break, but the wood groaned under the pressure, a dry, ominous sound that cut through the howl of the wind. The old woman, in response to the movement, let out a faint moan, almost a gasp of air, as her body was pulled once more, one last inch, closer to the edge of the abyss. Her fingers, already in tatters, slipped further, skin tearing against the smooth wood. Nora smelled the bull, earth, animal sweat, something wild and ancient. Her eyes met the beast's dark, deep eyes again. There was no triumph in them, no malice, just that ancestral indifference now tinged with a strange and unsettling patience. It was as if the bull were waiting, watching her struggle in her own web of cruelty and despair. She tried to pull the crutch, but it was like trying to move a rooted tree. The wood was firmly held, and the bull's strength was incalculable. Her own fingers slipped on the smooth, blood-dampened shaft. Panic transformed into absolute terror. She was trapped between the beast, the dying old woman, and the abyss. There was no escape, no plan that would work against that unyielding force. Time distorted. Each second was an eternity of agony. Nora could feel the pulse in her temples, blood hammering in her ears. The old woman was letting go. She had to let go. But the bull wouldn't release her, not in the way Nora wanted. In a final desperate burst of fury, Nora raised her hands, not for the crutch, but for the bull's horn itself. It was madness, a suicidal act. She would try to push the horn down, to dislodge the crutch, to force the old woman's fall. Her fingers closed around the bony, cold surface, feeling the rough texture and sharp tip. But the exact moment her fingers touched the horn, the bull moved. Not a violent movement, but a slow, powerful swing of its head. Not up, not down, but sideways. The crutch, still attached, was dragged along, and the old woman's body, already hanging by a thread, spun in the air, swaying precariously over the abyss. Nora let out a scream, not of rage, but of pure horror. The bull's swing didn't release the old woman. Instead, it flung her into a new, even more dangerous position. Now the old woman wasn't just hanging. She was spinning, her fragile body about to smash against the sharp rocks of the cliff face below, even before hitting the ocean. The end was near, but it would be an even more grotesque and prolonged spectacle. Nora, paralyzed, watched the old woman spin, a human pendulum swaying on the brink of annihilation. The old woman's body, a macabre and pathetic pendulum, spun in the air, each rotation a ticking of the final clock. It wasn't the clean, quick fall Nora had imagined, the abrupt end she desired for her mother-in-law. It was a slow horror show, a prolonged agony, where death would come in fragments torn by the sharp rocks protruding from the abyss. The shadows of the rock formations, once just a distant threat, now approached dangerously with each spin, ready to tear the old woman's fragile flesh. The scream that tore Nora's throat was now pure desperation, devoid of any remnant of cruelty. It was the sound of a predator who, suddenly, found herself caught in the trap she had set, not as a victim, but as a forced witness to an atrocity she could not control. The panic that had previously propelled her now paralyzed her for an instant. The terror of seeing the old woman's body smash against the stones, a horror that would stain her memory forever, more vivid than any satisfaction. Her eyes, wide and bloodshot, fixed on the crutch, the treacherous link between life and death, between the old woman and the bull. It was no longer about releasing the old woman, but about preventing the imminent carnage, the grotesque spectacle of a body disintegrating. With renewed energy, born of pure self-preservation instinct against the image that would haunt her, Nora lunged at the bull again. Her muscles screamed in protest, every fiber of her being crying out for relief. But she ignored the pain. She needed to grab the crutch, not to pull it off the horn, but to stabilize the old woman's body, to stop the fatal spin. Her fingers, already raw and numb with cold, stretched frantically, seeking the wooden shaft. The smell of the bull, earth, animal sweat. Something wild and ancient seemed to suffocate her, a constant reminder of the indomitable force that held her captive. The wind, a chorus of banshees, howled in her ears, and the roar of the ocean below sounded like a guttural laugh, mocking her impotence. But the bull, with its enigmatic patience and ancestral indifference, held its head steady. It was as if it understood Nora's intentions and, in its silent wisdom, chose to thwart them in an even more subtle way. At the exact moment Nora's fingers were about to touch the crutch, the bull made a minimal, almost imperceptible movement. It wasn't a violent swing, but a precise adjustment of its head, a slight tilt downwards and sideways, which altered the trajectory of the human pendulum. The crutch, still firmly attached to the horn, was dragged along, and the old woman's body, already hanging by a thread, spun with greater force, swinging even further from the cliff face, and then, with a cruel impetus, back towards it. The bull's movement didn't release the old woman, but flung her into a new, even more dangerous position. Now the old woman wasn't just spinning, she was swinging in a wider arc, and with each return, the distance between her fragile body and the sharp rocks of the cliff face drastically decreased. The wood of the crutch, already cracked and groaning under the tension, creaked again. A dry, ominous sound that cut through the howl of the wind, a sinister warning that it wouldn't hold much longer. The old woman's laments had ceased completely, replaced by a silence more terrifying than any scream. Her eyes, if still open, would be fixed on nothingness, her mind perhaps already on another plane or trapped in a limbo of pain and resignation. Nora felt a shiver run down her spine. She was the puppet now, her movements dictated by the beast, by the old woman, by the abyss. The hunter had become the hunted, trapped in a nightmare she herself had orchestrated. She tried again, stretching, her fingers scraping the smooth, blood-dampened surface of the crutch, but it was useless. The bull was an unyielding wall of flesh and bone, and the crutch, an extension of its silent will. With each swing, the distance between the old woman's body and the rocks decreased. 1, 2, perhaps 3 rotations before the final impact. Nora could see the sharp contours of the stones, the teeth of the abyss waiting to devour its prey. Time distorted, each second an eternity of agony. Pure, unadulterated terror consumed her, no longer from fear of being caught, but from the horror of witnessing the most grotesque and prolonged death she could imagine. A death that in some way was even crueler than the one she had planned. In a final, desperate burst of fury and despair, Nora did the unthinkable. She didn't try to pull the crutch nor push the bull. Instead, she grabbed the bull's horn with both hands, her fingers closing around the bony, cold surface, feeling the rough texture and sharp tip. Not to dislodge the crutch, but to try, somehow, to use the bull itself as a lever. She would try to push the bull back, away from the edge, so that the old woman could swing freely without hitting the rocks. It was madness, a suicidal act, but the alternative was the indelible image of the old woman's body being torn apart. The bull, however, didn't move. It remained a statue of flesh and bone, its strength incalculable. Nora pulled, pushed, her feet slipping on the loose earth. But the beast was unyielding. Its eyes, dark and deep, met Nora's again, and this time there was something more in them. It wasn't triumph, nor malice, nor even patience. It was a look of warning, as if to say, "You created this. Now, watch." And then, with a loud, ominous crack that echoed in the howl of the wind, the wood of the crutch finally gave way. It didn't break in half, but the leather strap which was attached to the bull's horn tore, a dry, final sound that sealed the old woman's fate. For a microsecond, the old woman's body remained suspended, a puppet without strings, before beginning its freefall. But it wasn't a clean fall. The crutch, now loose from the bull's horn, but still attached to the old woman's hand, spun with her, transforming into an uncontrolled projectile. The old woman wouldn't just fall, she would be dragged and struck by the very crutch that had saved her, in a chaotic and brutal descent into the abyss. The air tore with the dry, final sound of the leather strap giving way. For Nora, it was as if time itself had shattered. For a microsecond, the old woman's body remained suspended, a puppet without strings, an instant of unreal silence, before gravity claimed its prey. Then, the scream. Not from the old woman, who had already plunged into a terrifying silence, but from Nora. A primal, hoarse scream of pure horror and helplessness lost in the howl of the wind. The old woman's body plummeted. It wasn't a clean fall, a straight line into the abyss. The crutch, still firmly attached to her hand, spun with her, an uncontrolled projectile, a macabre appendage, now turned against its own owner. Nora saw, with terrible clarity, the crutch's wood whip through the air, striking the old woman's shoulder with a dull thud, then grazing her head, a blow that could have been fatal on its own, even before impact with the ocean or rocks. It was a chaotic, brutal descent, where death would come not just from the fall, but from a succession of blows and tears. Nora's eyes, wide and bloodshot, followed the old woman's trajectory, a dark speck against the greyish-blue sky and the dark grey of the rocks. Every inch of the fall was an eternity of agony. She could hear the whistling of the wind cutting through the air around the falling body, the sound intensifying with each meter. The ocean below, once a promise of oblivion, now seemed like a monster with open jaws, its foamy waves ready to swallow whatever remained. The terror that consumed her was no longer the fear of being caught, nor the frustration of her plans. It was the visceral horror of witnessing such a grotesque and prolonged death, a carnage that would stain her soul forever. She had wished for the old woman's death, yes, but not this death, not this cruel and inhuman spectacle, where the victim was torn apart even before reaching the bottom. The bull, a statue of flesh and bone, remained motionless on the edge of the precipice, its dark, deep eyes, previously filled with an enigmatic warning, now seemed to observe the scene with the same ancestral indifference, as if it were all just another cycle of nature, an inevitable consequence. Nora felt a shiver run down her spine. The beast was not a savior, nor an executioner. It was an observer, a catalyst, a mirror of Nora's own cruelty, reflecting it back in an even more distorted and uncontrollable form. The old woman continued to fall, her body spinning, the crutch whipping. The sharp rocks, the teeth of the abyss, approached rapidly. An impact was imminent. Nora closed her eyes for a second, unable to bear the sight of what would come next. But then, a sound. Not the sound of the final impact, but a sharp creak, a scrape of wood against stone, which cut through the howl of the wind and the roar of the ocean. Nora opened her eyes. What she saw defied all logic, all expectation. The old woman's body had not shattered. Instead, the crutch, in its chaotic and uncontrolled swing, had hooked, not on the strap which was already torn, but on the wooden shaft itself. The tip of the crutch, which the old woman still held with a death grip, had wedged into a narrow, deep crevice in one of the most prominent rocks of the cliff face, a few meters below the edge. The old woman's body, which had been in freefall, stopped abruptly, swinging violently like a pendulum. The crutch, now trapped, groaned under the weight, the wood cracking alarmingly. It wasn't a firm support. It wasn't salvation. It was an even more precarious, more agonizing suspension. The old woman was now hanging upside down, blood rushing to her head, her face pale and eyes closed, her mouth open in a silent scream that the wind stole. Her arms, previously stretched upwards, now hung limp, and the crutch was the only link between her and annihilation. Nora felt a knot in her throat. It was impossible. The universe, or some invisible force, seemed to conspire to prolong the suffering, to extend the agony of all involved. The old woman was not saved, but her death had been postponed again, in an even crueler and more spectacular way. The crutch, once a symbol of support, was now an instrument of torture, holding her in an inverted, humiliating pose on the brink of the abyss. The wood of the crutch, already cracked, began to creak again, a sound of protest echoing in the disturbing silence that followed Nora's scream. The crevice in the rock was shallow, and the tip of the crutch seemed about to slip at any moment. The wind, which had previously howled, now seemed to whisper, carrying with it the salty smell of the sea and the premonition of an inevitable end. Nora looked at the bull, The beast hadn't moved, but its eyes, fixed on the hanging old woman, now seemed to carry a new nuance, a kind of curiosity, as if it too were waiting, observing the final unfolding of a drama it had helped orchestrate. The tension was palpable, cutting. The old woman hung by a thread, and Nora, trapped on the edge of the abyss, was a forced witness to a horror show that seemed to have no end. The old woman hung by a thread, and Nora, trapped on the edge of the abyss, was a forced witness to a horror show that seemed to have no end. The creaking of the crutch's wood, now a continuous lament, was the only sound that seemed to carry weight, cutting through the howl of the wind and the distant roar of the ocean. With each gust, the crutch swayed, and with it the old woman's inert body, a macabre pendulum over the void. Blood, previously rushing to the old woman's head, now seemed to stagnate, and a purplish hue began to stain her pale face. Her eyes, still closed, seemed to sink into their sockets, and her mouth, previously open in a silent scream, now twisted into an expression of mute pain, a mask of agony solidifying with each passing second. Nora couldn't tear her gaze away. It was as if her own eyes were glued to that grotesque sight, forced to absorb every detail of the carnage unfolding. The salty smell of the sea now mixed with a metallic, acrid odor, the smell of fear and blood that seemed to emanate from the cliff face itself. Her lungs burned, each breath a torture, and her heart beat a frantic, erratic rhythm, a drum of despair in her chest. The cruelty she had planned was quick, efficient, an act of cold revenge. But this was prolonged torture, a theater of horrors where she was the sole spectator, and the victim, her own mother-in-law, was the main actor, hanging by a tenuous thread of wood and flesh. The bull, motionless as a basalt statue, remained on the edge, its dark, deep eyes fixed on the scene. There was no longer the curiosity from before, nor the enigmatic warning. Now there was a kind of ancient indifference, a millennial wisdom that seemed to say, "You sowed the wind, now reap the whirlwind." The beast was not a savior nor an executioner. It was a mirror, reflecting Nora's cruelty back to her in an even more distorted and uncontrollable form. The bull was the catalyst, the instrument of a fate Nora had forged with her own hands. Suddenly, a sound. Not the creaking of wood, but a dry, ominous snap that came from the rock. Nora blinked, her eyes wide, and saw. The crevice where the crutch was wedged was not as solid as it seemed. Small fragments of stone, the size of grains of sand, began to detach, silently cascading into the abyss. The rock, corroded by centuries of wind and sea, was giving way under the pressure. The crutch wasn't just slipping, its anchor point was disintegrating. A faint, hoarse moan escaped the old woman's lips. Her eyes, previously closed, now slowly opened, revealing a cloudy, unfocused gleam. She was conscious, or at least she was returning to a state of consciousness, only to be confronted with the reality of her inverted situation, hanging over the void. A tremor ran through her body, and Nora saw. The old woman's hand, which still held the crutch with a death grip, began to tremble. Her fingers, thin and bony, seemed to fight against gravity, against the pain, against the very life that was ebbing away. Nora felt a knot in her throat, a scream trapped in her chest. It was no longer the horror of death itself, but the horror of witnessing the old woman's struggle, the agony of every muscle, every tendon, every fiber of her being striving to cling to life, even if that life was merely an inverted suspension over annihilation. The crutch, once a symbol of her fragility, was now the only thing holding her, and the old woman was clinging to it with a desperate strength that defied her age and condition. The creaking of the crutch's wood intensified, a cry of protest echoing in the void. The crevice in the rock continued to widen, more fragments falling, and the crutch now seemed to tilt even further, the angle of its support becoming more precarious. The old woman's body swung again, a wider, more uncontrolled movement, and her eyes, now fixed on Nora's face, seemed to carry a mix of confusion, pain, and, for a fleeting instant, a flicker of recognition. A recognition that pierced Nora's soul like an icy knife. The old woman wasn't just hanging, she was being slowly torn apart, physically and psychologically. And Nora was the only one to see, the only one to hear, the only one to feel the weight of every second that stretched into an eternity of agony. The crutch, the link between life and death, was about to give way. The rock, the final support, was disintegrating, and the old woman, with her eyes fixed on Nora's, seemed to plead, not for salvation but for an end. Any end that could free her from that suspended purgatory. Nora felt panic rise in her throat, an icy, paralyzing panic. She had created a monster, and now the monster was devouring her piece by piece through the eyes of its victim. The recognition in the old woman's eyes was a blow. There was no rage, no hatred, just a silent plea, a desperate request for an end. It was Nora's soul being torn, not by the imminent fall, but by the sight of that prolonged agony, that pathetic and heroic struggle against the inevitable. Panic rose in her throat, a tight knot that prevented air from entering. She had wished for the old woman's death, yes, but not this death, not this suspended purgatory where every second was torture, and she was the sole witness, the sole executioner. The snapping of the rock became more frequent, more audible, cutting through the lament of the crutch's wood. Small pebbles, once grains of sand, were now larger fragments, detaching from the crevice and falling in a terrifying silence, like tears of stone. The rock, corroded by time and the ocean's fury, was giving way. The crutch no longer slipped. Its anchor point was disintegrating under the old woman's weight, under the pressure of a life that refused to be extinguished. The old woman's eyes, wide and cloudy, did not waver from Nora's. It was a gaze that burned, accused, pleaded. Her mouth, previously contorted in a mask of pain, now seemed to try to form words, but only a hoarse wheeze escaped, swallowed by the wind. Her fingers, bony and pale, trembled, but still clung to the crutch with a tenacity that defied logic. It was the brute force of the survival instinct, the last flame of life burning furiously before extinguishing. Nora felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, or perhaps it was her own body convulsing. The salty smell of the sea, once invigorating, was now nauseating, mixed with the metallic odor of fear and something more, something resembling the smell of damp stone and despair. Her lungs burned, each breath a needle in her chest. She wanted to scream, wanted to run, wanted to close her eyes and make everything disappear, but she was trapped, chained to that edge, forced to watch the spectacle of her own cruelty. The creaking of the crutch reached an ominous crescendo, a final lament before collapse. The crevice in the rock opened further, revealing an irregular, deep crater. The tip of the crutch, previously wedged, was now merely resting on a precarious splinter, about to break free. The old woman's body swung violently, an uncontrolled pendulum over the abyss, and a scream, this time audible, tore through the air. It wasn't a scream of pain, but of pure horror, of recognition of imminent annihilation, and then a movement. Not from the old woman, not from the rock, but from the bull. The beast, which until then had been a basalt statue, an indifferent observer, moved. Its powerful muscles contracted, and it leaned its massive head over the edge of the precipice. Nora held her breath. What would it do? Push the old woman? Let her fall? The bull's dark, deep eyes, previously filled with ancestral indifference, now seemed to focus on the crutch, on the precarious anchor point. It moved its head slowly, with terrifying precision, as if measuring the distance, calculating the angle. Nora felt a chilling shiver run down her spine. The beast was not a blind instrument of fate. There seemed to be an intention, a cold intelligence behind its movements. The bull leaned even further, the cliff edge yielding slightly under its colossal weight. A sound of earth and small stones falling accompanied its movement. The old woman's body swinging was now mere inches from the animal's muzzle. The bull's left horn, sharp and polished by time, moved with deliberate slowness. Nora watched, paralyzed, every fiber of her being screaming in silence. And then it happened. With a smooth movement almost imperceptible for an animal of its size, the bull hooked its horn, not on the crutch's shaft, which was about to break free, but on the upper handle, the curved wooden part the old woman used to rest her arm. The handle, though the fabric strap was torn, was still a solid structure. The bull's horn fit perfectly, as if made for it, securing the crutch with unexpected firmness. The creaking of the crutch's wood ceased abruptly, the snapping of the rock too. A heavy, unreal silence fell over the abyss, broken only by the distant howl of the wind and the muffled roar of the ocean. The old woman was no longer falling. She was no longer hanging by the disintegrating rock. She was now suspended in the air, upside down, her inert body swaying gently, held by the bull's horn. Nora couldn't process the image. It was grotesque, surreal, a scene straight out of a feverish nightmare. The old woman, her mother-in-law, hanging like a macabre ornament on the horn of a colossal bull over the void. The animal, motionless again, kept its head lowered, its left horn raised, supporting the weight of the woman and the crutch with terrifying ease. Its dark eyes, previously fixed on the old woman, now seemed to turn to Nora, an enigmatic and deep gleam, as if to say, "You wanted a spectacle, here is your spectacle." The tension was unbearable, denser than the mist beginning to rise from the abyss. The old woman was saved from imminent fall, yes, but her salvation was a new form of torture, an even more precarious, more humiliating suspension. She was literally at the mercy of the beast, a toy hanging from its horn, a living trophy over the precipice. Nora felt the bitter taste of vomit rise in her throat. It wasn't just the horror of the scene, but the understanding that the bull was not a savior. It was an even crueler executioner, a master of ceremonies who had decided to prolong the suffering, to extend the agony, not only of the old woman, but of Nora herself. It was forcing her to witness every second, every breath, every heartbeat of the woman she had condemned. The bull was the mirror of her own cruelty, reflecting it back in an even more distorted and uncontrollable form. And now the old woman was hanging by a thread, not from the rock, but from the horn of a bull, an even more bizarre and terrifying link between life and death. The image burned into Nora's retina like a fiery tattoo. The old woman, her mother-in-law, hanging upside down, no longer by the precarious rock, but by the polished horn of a colossal bull. It was a scene from a feverish nightmare, a grotesque and surrealist painting colored with horror and disbelief. The silence that followed the hooking of the crutch was more deafening than any scream. A vacuum that swallowed the sound of the wind and the sea, leaving only the echo of Nora's own ragged breath. The old woman was inert, her body swaying gently like a macabre pendulum. Her white hair, once neatly arranged, now cascaded into the abyss, almost touching the mist that lazily rose. Her eyes, previously fixed on Nora's with a silent plea, were now closed, or perhaps rolled back, hidden by the inverted position. Was she unconscious again, or was consciousness a luxury the body in its agony had refused to sustain? Nora didn't know, and the uncertainty was crueler than any answer. The bull, in turn, remained motionless, a living statue of basalt and muscle, with its head lowered, its left horn raised, supporting the weight of the woman and the crutch with terrifying ease. Its dark eyes, previously focused on the old woman, now seemed to turn to Nora, an enigmatic and deep gleam, as if to say, "You wanted a spectacle. Here is your spectacle. The tension was unbearable, denser than the mist beginning to rise from the abyss, enveloping them in a damp, cold veil. The old woman was saved from imminent fall, yes, but her salvation was a new form of torture, an even more precarious, more humiliating suspension. She was literally at the mercy of the beast, a toy hanging from its horn, a living trophy over the precipice. The wind howled, now sounding like a lament, a ghostly chorus echoing the insanity of the situation. Nora tried to move, but her feet seemed rooted in the damp earth. Her mind screamed at her to do something, anything, but her body refused to obey. What could she do? Push the bull? Pull the old woman? The idea was absurd, suicidal. The bull was a force of nature, a primordial entity that seemed to have emerged from the depths of the earth to judge her sins. The crutch, once a symbol of fragility, was now the anchor of a life, caught on the bull's horn. The wooden handle, where the horn was lodged, seemed solid, but Nora knew that wood, even strong, had its limits, and the old woman's body, though inert, was still a weight. How long would that structure hold? How long would the bull maintain its position? The uncertainty was a slow torture, corroding Nora's sanity with each beat of her racing heart. A faint moan escaped the old woman's lips, an almost inaudible sound, but one that pierced the silence like a blade. Her eyes opened again, slowly, and Nora saw terror mix with confusion. She was conscious. And now, she wasn't just hanging, but was hanging by the horn of a beast, her body inverted, her view of the world upside down. The recognition in the old woman's eyes was no longer a plea for an end, but pure horror, a comprehension of the surreal and cruel dimension of her purgatory. The bull, as if responding to the moan, moved, not an abrupt movement, but a slight tilt of its massive head. The horn, with the old woman hanging, swayed slightly. Nora's heart leaped into her throat. Was this the end? Would it release her now? Or would it swing her sideways against the rocks before letting her fall? Nora's mind spun in a whirlwind of macabre scenarios. But the bull didn't release her. It merely adjusted its position, an almost imperceptible movement, as if testing the weight, or perhaps just reasserting its control. Its eyes, again fixed on Nora's, seemed to gleam with a cold, almost mocking intelligence. It wasn't just prolonging the agony, it was playing with her, with the old woman, with Nora, with fate. Nora felt her legs weaken. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tilt, the abyss opening to swallow her too. She wanted to scream, wanted to beg, wanted it all to end. But the words were caught in her throat, choked by panic and guilt. The bull was her judge, her executioner, and the spectacle it orchestrated was her own private hell. And the old woman, hanging like a macabre ornament, was the living testament to her cruelty, an inverted mirror of her own soul. The mist rose denser now, beginning to obscure the figures of the bull and the old woman, threatening to swallow them in a veil of mystery and despair. But Nora knew that even if the sight disappeared, the image would be forever etched in her mind. The image of the suspended old woman was a brand of fire on Nora's soul. The mist rising from the abyss, a merciful veil for the world, was a cruel curtain for her, imprisoning her gaze in the macabre tableau. Her mind, a battlefield of terror and regret, replayed the sequence of events, each frame more agonizing than the last. The bull, a silent and colossal sentinel, held not just a life, but Nora's sanity in the delicate balance of its horn. A shiver ran through the old woman's suspended form, her eyes now fully open, fixed on the abyss, a sea of mist and darkness that stretched infinitely. Her world had turned upside down, literally. The sky was the ground was the sky. The sound of the wind, once a distant lament, now seemed to howl directly into her ears, a chorus of spectral voices announcing her fate. She tried to scream, but only a dry wheeze escaped her cracked lips. Gravity pulled her blood to her head, a throbbing pressure that threatened to burst her eyes. The terror was no longer just of the fall, but of existence itself, of being a hanging toy at the mercy of a beast and a cruel daughter-in-law. The bull, as if sensing the old woman's renewed agony, moved its head again, a slow, calculated movement that made the crutch swing dangerously. The horn, polished and sharp, seemed a natural extension of the rock, a pillar of death and suspension. Its eyes, previously enigmatic, now burned with a cold intensity, an intelligence that defied nature. They didn't look at the old woman, nor at Nora, but through them, to something deeper, darker. It was a judgment, Nora realized, not just of the old woman, but of herself. The bull was not an animal, it was a herald, an executor of primordial justice, a force that had been awakened by her own malevolence. Nora's helplessness was a chain that bound her to the ground. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to act, to intervene, to undo the horror she had created. But what to do? Rushing forward would be suicide. The bull was a mountain of flesh and fury. Pull the old woman? Impossible. The distance, the height, the weight, the beast, everything conspired against her. The mist rose higher, enveloping the scene in a milky veil, but not diminishing the visual impact. On the contrary, the partial view made everything more ghostly, more unreal, like a nightmare that refused to dissipate. The smell of damp earth and sea salt mixed with the metallic odor of fear rising from her own skin. A snap, faint, almost inaudible, but it pierced the silence like a gunshot. Nora held her breath. The sound came from the crutch. The wooden handle, where the bull's horn was firmly lodged, seemed to be giving way. A small crack, thin as a hair, began to form in the aged wood. The old woman, feeling the vibration, opened her eyes again, and a stronger moan escaped her lips. She tried to squirm, a desperate attempt to relieve the pressure, to cling to something, but her movements only worsened the situation, making the crutch swing even more. The bull's horn, once a macabre savior, was now the tip of a sword, its sharp edge threatening to sever the last link to life. The bull, however, remained impassive. Its eyes, fixed on Nora, seemed to register every nuance of her terror, every frantic beat of her heart. It was not an animal acting on instinct, it was an observer, a judge who savored every second of the punishment. The crack in the crutch deepened, slow, inexorable. Nora felt cold sweat trickle down her back. She had wished for the old woman's death, yes, but not like this. Not with this prolonged cruelty, this suspended agony, this visual torture that was tearing her apart from within. She wanted the old woman to fall, for the suffering to end, so she could forget, so the image wouldn't haunt her forever. But the bull refused to grant her that mercy. The wind picked up, whipping Nora's hair against her face, bringing with it the strong scent of earth and the saltiness of the sea. The mist was now so dense that the figures of the bull and the old woman seemed like ghosts, faded silhouettes against the void. But the image was etched in her mind with brutal clarity. She could feel the old woman's weight, the creaking of the wood, the bull's gaze, even if she could barely see them. She was trapped there, a prisoner of her own crime, forced to watch the spectacle she had initiated. Time seemed to have stopped, stretched into an eternal present of horror. Every second was an eternity, every breath a burden. The old woman, with superhuman effort, managed to open her eyes again, and this time her gaze met Nora's. There was no longer plea nor pure terror. There was a grim acceptance, and perhaps a hint of silent condemnation. A last gasp, another moan, and her body seemed to relax slightly, as if the struggle had finally drained away. The crutch, however, still held her, a stubborn link to life or to prolonged death. The crack in the wood, now more visible, looked like an open wound about to rupture. The bull, as if sensing the change in the old woman's state, moved its head once more. An almost imperceptible movement, but one that made the crutch swing with a new and alarming instability. Nora felt a scream rise in her throat, but it died in a hoarse wheeze. She was on the verge of collapse, her mind oscillating between reality and madness. The bull was her executioner, the old woman her victim, and she the condemned witness. The spectacle was not for the old woman, it was for her, so that she would feel every gram of pain, every drop of terror, every moment of despair she had inflicted. The mist, now, almost completely swallowed the scene, leaving only shadows and the promise of an imminent, yet painfully delayed end. The sound of the ocean, previously muffled, seemed to intensify, a primordial roar clamoring for sacrifice. The roar of the ocean, once a distant lament, now became a guttural clamor, a chorus of 1,000 throats thirsty for an end, for a sacrifice. The mist, a thick, milky veil, almost completely swallowed the scene, transforming the colossal figure of the bull and the old woman's hanging body into mere ghostly shadows, faded silhouettes against the void. But the sight, even obscured, was burned into Nora's mind, every detail amplified by terror. She could feel the old woman's weight, the agonizing creak of the wood, the bull's icy gaze, even if she could barely see them. She was trapped there, a prisoner of her own crime, forced to watch the macabre spectacle she herself had initiated. Time, a malleable entity, seemed to have stretched, each second an eternity of horror. The crack in the crutch, once a hairline, now widened, an open wound in the aged wood, exposing the taut fibers about to rupture. A new snap, louder, sharper, echoed in the damp air, a sound that pierced the silence like a gunshot and made Nora's heart leap into her throat. The bull's horn, once a macabre savior, was now the tip of a sword, its sharp edge threatening to sever the last link to life. The bull, as if sensing the change in the old woman's state, moved its head once more. It wasn't an abrupt movement, but an almost imperceptible, calculated adjustment that made the crutch swing with a new and alarming instability. The crack deepened further, a groan of tortured wood that sounded like a lament. Nora felt a scream rise in her throat, but it died in a hoarse wheeze, choked by panic and guilt. The bull was not an animal acting on instinct. It was an observer, a judge who savored every second of the punishment. Its eyes, previously enigmatic, now burned with a cold intensity, an intelligence that defied nature. They didn't look at the old woman, nor at Nora, but through them, to something deeper, darker. It was a judgment, Nora realized, not just of the old woman, but of herself. The bull was not an animal, it was a herald, an executor of primordial justice, a force that had been awakened by her own malevolence. Nora's helplessness was a chain that bound her to the ground, stronger than any steel. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to act, to intervene, to undo the horror she had created. But what to do? Rushing forward would be suicide. The bull was a mountain of flesh and fury. Pull the old woman? Impossible. The distance, the height, the weight, the beast. Everything conspired against her. The mist now almost completely swallowed the scene, leaving only shadows and the promise of an imminent, yet painfully delayed, end. The smell of damp earth and sea salt mixed with the metallic odor of fear rising from her own skin. She had wished for the old woman's death, yes, but not like this. Not with this prolonged cruelty, this suspended agony, this visual torture that was tearing her apart from within. She wanted the old woman to fall, for the suffering to end, so she could forget, so the image wouldn't haunt her forever. But the bull refused to grant her that mercy. The spectacle was not for the old woman. It was for her, so that she would feel every gram of pain, every drop of terror, every moment of despair she had inflicted. The mist now almost completely swallowed the scene, leaving only shadows and the promise of an imminent yet painfully delayed end. The sound of the ocean, previously muffled, seemed to intensify, a primordial roar clamoring for sacrifice. And amidst that clamor, another snap, stronger, sharper, reverberated in the air. The crack in the crutch was no longer a wound. It was an almost complete fracture, a silent scream of the wood surrendering. The handle now hung by a thread of fibers, a last, desperate link. The old woman's body, previously relaxed, shuddered, and a guttural sound, almost a gasp, escaped her throat. Her eyes, wide, met Nora's one last time, not with condemnation, but with a renewed terror, the final understanding that the end was, indeed, inevitable. The old woman's eyes, wide and moist, fixed on Nora's, no longer with the silent condemnation that had tormented her, but with a primordial terror, the final and brutal understanding that the end was, indeed, inevitable. It was the image of a cornered animal, of a soul that saw the abyss open beneath its feet. A tremor ran through her body, a final spasm of life before surrender, and then the sound. Not a dry, quick snap, but a prolonged, agonizing groan of tearing wood. The last fibers of the crutch, stretched to their limit, gave way with a lament that seemed to echo the old woman's pain. It was a sound that pierced the mist and the roar of the ocean, a silent scream of materialized despair. The bull's horn, previously firmly lodged in the handle, was now free, a gleaming ivory point in the gloom. The old woman's body plummeted. There was no scream, only a hoarse sigh, a final gasp that was lost in the wind. The faded figure for an instant seemed to float, an abandoned rag doll, before gravity claimed her with relentless veracity. Nora, paralyzed, felt a shout rise in her throat, but it dissolved into an inaudible wheeze, trapped in her chest, suffocating her. She extended her hand, a useless, desperate gesture, as if she could grasp the air, halt the inevitable. The mist, like a cruel veil, seemed to part for 1,000th of a second, granting Nora a fleeting glimpse of the old woman's body spinning in the void, rapidly diminishing, a dark speck against the grey of the abyss. The image burned into her retina with disturbing clarity, a flash of horror that would haunt her forever. And then the veil closed again, swallowing the scene, leaving only the void and the echo of the fall in her mind. The sound of impact. Nora waited for it, every fiber of her being contracted, anticipating the final thud. But it never came. Or perhaps the ocean, in its infinite and indifferent grandeur, had swallowed it. The roar of the waves, once a distant clamor, now seemed to have transformed into a deafening silence, a vacuum that absorbed everything, including the old woman's soul. A heavy, absolute silence, more terrifying than any scream. Nora staggered, her legs failing beneath her. The thin air seemed to have been sucked from her lungs. She fell to her knees on the damp earth, her hands sinking into the cold mud. The smell of earth and sea salt, now mixed with the metallic odor of fear and guilt emanating from her own skin. Her eyes, wide and empty, turned to the bull. It was still there, imposing, colossal, a statue of flesh and bone emerging from the mist. Its eyes, previously enigmatic, now burned with a cold intensity, an intelligence that defied nature, fixed on Nora. There was no triumph, no fury, just a glacial observation, a silent acceptance of the judgment that had been executed. The bull was not an animal acting on instinct. It was the herald, the executor of a primordial justice, a force that had been awakened by Nora's malevolence and now condemned her. The spectacle was not for the old woman. It was for her. And now the final act had been consummated. The bull, the silent judge, had pronounced its sentence, and Nora's punishment, she knew, was only just beginning. The silence of the ocean, once a lament, was now a requiem, a chorus of 1,000 throats that clamored not for sacrifice, but for penitence. And Nora, kneeling in the mud, felt the weight of each of those voices, the echo of each wave, the cold of death that now enveloped her. The mist, a thick, milky veil, almost completely swallowed the scene, leaving only shadows and the promise of an imminent end. Not for the old woman, but for Nora's own sanity. The silence that followed the old woman's fall was not a relief, but a vacuum, a sonic abyss more terrifying than any scream. Nora, kneeling in the cold mud, felt the metallic smell of fear mix with the odor of damp earth and sea salt, a nauseating cocktail that invaded her nostrils and her soul. She had waited for the impact, the final thud that would seal the old woman's fate and perhaps the beginning of her own oblivion. But the ocean, in its colossal indifference, had swallowed the sound, leaving only a void that seemed to suck away light itself, hope itself. Her eyes, wide and empty, turned to the bull. It was still there, imposing, colossal, a statue of flesh and bone emerging from the mist, which now thickened with every passing second. Its eyes, previously enigmatic, burned with a cold intensity, an intelligence that defied nature, fixed on Nora. There was no triumph, no fury, just a glacial observation, a silent acceptance of the judgment that had been executed. The bull was not an animal acting on instinct. It was the herald, the executor of a primordial justice, a force that had been awakened by Nora's malevolence and now condemned her. The silence of the ocean, once a lament, was now a requiem, a chorus of 1,000 throats that clamored not for sacrifice, but for penitence. And Nora, kneeling in the mud, felt the weight of each of those voices, the echo of each wave, the cold of death that now enveloped her. The mist, a thick, milky veil, almost completely swallowed the scene, leaving only shadows and the promise of an imminent end, not for the old woman, but for Nora's own sanity. She tried to stand, but her muscles seemed to have turned to lead. Every fiber of her being screamed in agony, not physical, but a pain that pierced the soul. The image of the old woman falling, spinning in the void, with eyes wide with terror, replayed in her mind like an infernal loop. The bull, without a single movement, without a single sound, seemed to absorb the light around it, becoming an even darker, denser mass in the gloom. Its eyes, however, gleamed with a supernatural intensity, beacons of an eternal judgment. Nora felt a cold that did not come from the wind or the mist, but from within herself. It was the cold of absolute solitude, of inescapable guilt, of madness approaching like a high tide. She had planned the old woman's death, yes, but she never imagined it would be like this. A prolonged torture, a relentless mirror of her own cruelty, orchestrated by a creature that seemed to have stepped out of a primordial nightmare. She closed her eyes, wishing the darkness would swallow her, that the mist would become a final shroud. But the darkness she found behind her eyelids was even more vivid, filled with the old woman's face, with the bull's horn, with the abyss that now existed within her. The roar of the ocean, once a distant clamor, now seemed to resonate in her ears, not as waves but as voices, accusatory whispers that multiplied, echoing her name, her crime. A moan escaped her cracked lips, a sound lost in the vastness of the mist and the sea. She didn't know how much time had passed, or how much longer she would remain there, kneeling, trapped. The bull didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough, a silent and perpetual sentence. Nora, the cruel, the murderer, was condemned not to physical death but to something far worse, to live with the ghost of her crime, with the bull's gaze etched into her soul, and with the deafening silence of an ocean that had swallowed life, but left guilt intact. The mist now was her veil, her tomb, and the bull, her eternal jailer. The old woman's end was only the beginning of Nora's end.